Well, this is part one of a briefing that we're calling The Roots of War. It's pretty obvious as you pick up every day's paper that we're on the threshold of major confrontations. And we felt it would be useful to profile the main players in the Middle East. Most of us know a lot about current events from the newspapers, but these conflicts we're going to deal with are not a question of turf or money or political opportunism in the traditional sense that has often motivated conflicts. The roots of the ostensible wars on the horizon go very, very deep. The motivations are very, very different, and we want to explore that. Most of us know some of these things from our biblical studies, but again, there are blind spots that we hope we can plug here a little bit. So we're going to take a look at the roots of war, realizing that most of the players today are nuclear or nuclear capable. That changes the horizon. And I'm always reminded of the witch's cauldron in Macbeth. Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. And our cauldron consists of about 10 major players in the Middle East and eastward from there that we'll take a quick look at. Our agenda will be, first of all, just to profile broadly the ancient empires, because they've left their footprints on history and that impacts today. We'll take a look at Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and then the eastern extension of Rome called the Byzantine Empire. Those are probably familiar to most of us because of the biblical implications. But there are other empires that we'll touch on briefly that also impact history, that unless we've done some unusual reading, most of us may not be as sensitive to some of these names. Then we're going to look at the current contestants on the horizon: Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. And we'll include Turkey. Even though it's a NATO member, it is a very key player in the strategic balance of the Middle East. And of course, we'll also add India and Pakistan. They're not part of the Middle East in the traditional sense, but since they're right on the threshold of going to war, and many of the experts are fearful that it may escalate into a nuclear exchange between them, I thought we'd include them as an addenda. But we'll climax our profiling by looking at Israel, but we'll do that in the second session, because we're going to put that in quite a different perspective. We're going to look at what the real war is. Even Israel probably doesn't appreciate what the real war is that's going on. So we'll devote the second session to that issue. Let's take a quick look at the ancient empires, the tides of history. All the scientists seem to agree that civilization seems to have had its beginning in the area called the Fertile Crescent. And clearly this is also the biblical presentation. This is the place where a guy by the name of Nimrod, the first world dictator, set up the first world empire. That his Babel, his tower to the gateway to heaven, became Babylon ultimately. And there was an Egyptian empire and an Assyrian empire, but the first major empire that we run into is the Babylonian Empire that we see in the Bible, which covers pretty much that same area. And it's during the Babylonian Empire that the king of Babylon has a disturbing dream that God has Daniel interpret for him. It's a profile of all the empires that would follow it. And he saw this peculiar dream where a metal image is standing, a head of gold, arms and chest of silver, belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, and then the feet are iron mixed with clay. And then he sees and we know from Daniel's interpretation of all this, both from Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 and 8, that the head of gold represents Babylon, which was an empire from about the 606 BC through about 539 BC. But it's taken over by Persia, which lasts for about 2 centuries. The silver represents that. The brass represents Greece, which goes from about 332 to about 68 BC. When Alexander the Great dies, it breaks into 4 pieces. We'll take a look at that. And then we get to Rome, which goes from 68 to 476, but we also understand from both Daniel 2 and 7 and other passages that Rome wasn't conquered, it broke into pieces. And the Bible portrays these pieces as reassembling into a revived Roman Empire to be the primary entity when God himself sets up his own kingdom. It's interesting that there are 4 empires here: gold, silver, brass, and iron. gets very important to understand history, but it's also paramount to understand Bible prophecy. And of course, most commentators recognize that the Fourth Empire is in two phases. So the Persian Empire replaces the Babylon, and it reaches further, of course, and it gets succeeded by the Greek Empire. Now, Alexander the Great is the key player, of course. At the age of 29, he fell onto his bed, weeping because there were no more worlds left to conquer. When he passes away, the empire is divided up among his four generals. But subsequently, Rome emerges as the dominant empire. Most of us are somewhat familiar with this because it's so foundational to understanding of Western history of Europe. We'll discover that we all have a blind spot because the Roman Empire really had two legs, just as Daniel's or Nebuchadnezzar's metal image had two legs. And that has profound implications for the future that are often overlooked even by many, many prophecy writers. And what's also going on then in the 7th century is that Muhammad is born, and he repackages the existing worship in that region into a unique form called Islam. And it's a warrior code. There's a quick conquest, and that starts to grow very rapidly into a very large empire. In just very few years, he conquers, Islam reaches much of the known world. In fact, it reaches into Spain and was threatening to go into Europe until Charles Martel at Tours, France, stopped him and drove them back to the Pyrenees. And that if he hadn't done that, most of Europe would be speaking Arabic. So that was the big major milestone in history for lots of reasons. Now, if you want more background, of course, we have a briefing pack called The Sword of Allah that goes into what Islam is really all about. But let's move on. The Roman Empire starts to fall apart in about the 5th century. But in 330, the Emperor Constantine had moved the capital from Rome to Byzantium and renamed it Constantinople. And so we often, from the West, overlook the implications of the Byzantine Empire because as time goes on, it begins to collapse. One of the problems are the Crusades. For a while, they were very profitable, but they also drained, and I won't go through all the Crusades, but they had divided agendas, and they're pretty much, in general, pretty much a disaster. But in 1204, even Constantinople falls, and it's a pretty dismal history with the Crusades. But as you get to the 16th century, we have the rise of Islam codifying itself in the form of the Ottoman Empire, ruled by the Ottomans from Turkey primarily. And something most of us don't study because it doesn't affect us directly is the other incredible empires. The largest empire that's ever been grown was, of course, Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. And one of his sons, the Kublai Khan, his grandson actually, takes over China. And there are other parts of it that take various parts of the world. The Golden Horde takes up north, and due to the aggressiveness of some of the intermediate conquerors from Central Asia, the Golden Horde breaks down. The Vikings from the north break in and really make up what today is Russia. But with that quick background, of course, our focus in the Middle East is Israel. We're going to look at Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Iran as the major players there. And we'll just take a quick profile of the more recent history in each one of those. And we'll also take a look at Turkey, a member of NATO. And we'll also take a quick look at India and try to explain the background of Pakistan. So many people don't really realize where Pakistan came from and what the issues are. So with that, let's move in and talk about Iraq. It's probably, in many respects, to a biblicist, it's one of the most interesting because it's the region of Mesopotamia. The word Mesopotamia means between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This is where the Garden of Eden was and so forth. So much of our biblical roots come from this area. It's the cradle of civilization in many respects. Now, as you look at this area, Iraq, of course, is cradling right where these early empires had their start. And as we move right in here, you can see its strategic location, because it's south of Turkey, it's east of Syria and Jordan, north of Saudi Arabia, and west of Iran. It has a very, very limited but critical access, of course, to a seaport. Many people don't realize that. So it's a very, very strategic piece of ground, and right in the centroid of it, just about 65 miles south of Baghdad, is Babylon. And Babylon at the moment is just some ceremonial buildings rebuilt by Saddam Hussein, but their presence there are profoundly significant from a biblical point of view. But it's not our intention to exhaust that. I couldn't resist throwing in a picture, however, of the Tigris River. It's one of those, Tigris and Euphrates, such romantic names from the Bible. It's interesting to see a picture with highways and industry along those banks. It's a vital place today. Well, Iraq, of course, was the source of the Sumer Empire, Hammurabi and all of that, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, as we've just reviewed through Rome. But the Persian dynasties were very powerful there. From the 8th to the 13th century, there's the Muslim invasion in spades. And the caliphs there ruled from Baghdad. In the 13th century, the Mongols sack Baghdad, so they have that influence there. But then in the 16th century, the Turks conquest it, and that leads to the Ottoman Empire, which secures control in 1831. So that's a quick profile. The Ottoman Empire is the primary empire that obtains until the end of the First World War. We'll pick up the modern history pretty much from there. In the late 19th century, Iraq was the primary area of rivalry between the Germans and the English in the region. And it was in 1909 that the Anglo-Persian Oil Company formed. Now, with the beginning of cars, it's interesting, very, very early, these oil finds turn out to be very strategic, not just economically, but obviously drive the politics of the region. And of course, from 1914 to 1918 is World War I. Turkey makes the mistake of entering on the side of Germany. Britain, though, invades Mesopotamia in 1914 and controls Baghdad before the end of the war. But 1922, after the war, the independent state of Iraq was established. And there's a very key agreement that shows up in many of these discussions called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, pulled together in 1916. It was a secret wartime agreement between Britain and France, agreeing to divide between them the lands of their enemy, the Ottoman Empire. In other words, the war isn't over yet, but they're already dividing up between them. And Russia was also a participant, but the primary players are Britain and France. Once World War I would end, they had a secret agreement how they were going to divide up the Ottoman Empire. Now, during the war, as an incentive, the Arabs had been promised independent states in the areas that were formerly controlled by Turkey. Well, the impact of this agreement is that Faisal al-Hussein, under the leadership of General Allenby, who of course was very successful, and under the tactical supervision of a colonel by the name of T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, if you will, he assisted these people assisted against the Turkish army during the war. So Faisal was awarded rule of the newly created state of Iraq under a British protective mandate. That mandate would be terminated when Iraq was admitted to the League of Nations later in 1932. There's going to be a lot of bitter feeling come out of the discovery of the Sykes-Picot Agreement by the Arabs because their promises, some of them weren't kept, but the other promises, it gets complicated as we get into it. Well, the Iraq Petroleum Oil Company is formed. World War II comes along. The British forces present assure that we have Allied support from there. And of course, you get to 1948, when Israel's formed, there was, of course, a war with Israel, and Iraq quickly joins with Transjordan against Israel. That brings us to the 50s, and there's a whole series of pro-Western pacts that don't endure. They've always been really anti-West in their heart. 1963, there's a military coup by the Ba'ath Party, which is the party still in power. It's Saddam Hussein's background. In 1967, of course, we have the Six-Day War with Israel, the famous one. In 1968, of course, they got clobbered in the 1967 war, so in 1968, the government's overthrown. But even the new government has hostility to the West and embraces the USSR. 1973 brings the Yom Kippur War, again, a war with Israel. And even when they had a ceasefire announced, Iraq, both in 1973 and the year following, denounced the ceasefire, and they denounced the various agreements with both Egypt and Syria. So and in 1975, they nationalized their oil industry. There is a country that doesn't show up, that is a de facto group that we need to be aware of, called the Kurds. Many scholars believe the Kurds are the name for the Medes today. And about 50% of this group is in Turkey, about 25% in northwestern Iran, and about 17% in northern Iraq. And they are a people without a country. And they're abused as a minority by each of their host countries. So you'll see them constantly surface as a problem. In 1974, the Iraqi Kurds are assisted by Iran. And Iran was helping the Kurds in Iraq cause trouble for Iraq. Well, they finally negotiated. Iran ceased supporting that in exchange for some border concessions. But that kind of thing continues to go on between all three countries there. One way they injure their neighbors is by helping the rebels, if you follow me. In 1979, Saddam Hussein succeeds Bakr. And in 1980 through 88, we have an 8-year war with Iran, a very bitter war. It's interesting, this is one of the wars in the Middle East that has absolutely nothing to do with Israel. I mention that only because there's this myth that's promoted that, gee, if you solve the Israeli problem, there'll be peace in the Middle East. That's utter nonsense. There's no peace in any direction anyway, independent of Israel. Everybody overlooks that. But during that war, the Mossad discovers that there's a nuclear reactor emerging in the Iranian picture, so they send a strike team and they wipe it out. And there's an interesting book by Dan McKinnon, who's president of North American Airlines, that he wrote the book about the strike. It's interesting. The world condemns Israel for that strike. And yet, can you imagine 10 years later during the Persian Gulf War where we'd be if Iraq had had nuclear weapons? And no one thanks Israel. If it wasn't for them, they probably would have. Of course, in 91, we have the Persian Gulf War. And obviously, the U.S., British, and French forces invade. But something that you overlook, too, as part of that, after they solved some of the basic problems, was to protect 600,000 Kurds from reprisals by Saddam Hussein. He was using chemical weapons on his own people. But see, they were Kurds. They don't count, see. Well, the tensions continue. The UN put a trade embargo on it. The inspections, of course, have been resisted and thwarted in every which way. In 1993, there was even a cruise missile attack by the U.S. because of an apparent attempt on President Bush. In 94, the Iraqi has a buildup on the Kuwait border for a second time, 40,000 troops, 600 aircraft sent. But Hussein finally signs a decree on Kuwait's sovereignty and territorial integrity. He was going to try it a second time, but backed off. The Kurdish resistance and civil war continues. There are two groups there, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan and the Kurdistan Democratic Party. These are two groups of Kurds that can't get along with each other. And everybody that's in the area meddles by backing one or the other to fan the hostilities. In 1996, Hussein sends 30,000 troops for the KDP. The international forces that were there then withdraw and leave the PUK on its own. And of course, in a couple of years, the KDP controls 2/3 of the region. But again, you've got these rebels with their own agenda, but you've also got the international players in there meddling. So it's a mess. And of course, the economic crisis worsened. Well, what's the current status? The no-fly zones continue to be monitored and violated. $97 million apparently is earmarked for the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. And everybody's wondering, why can't the CIA pull it off? And the UN inspection non-compliance still continues. Terrorist support continues. U.S. and British airstrikes continue. What's getting a little nervous is there are strategic weapons available, 1,000-mile range ballistic missiles. Atomic, biological, and chemical weapons seem to be well evidenced, but it's very hard to get good information because of the exile of the UN inspectors. And there is great anxiety at the moment in our own Congress, in Washington, that Bush seems to be moving towards hitting Iraq, but this will not be Afghanistan. This is not a third world country. This is a high-tech place. And it's scary because the only way you hit a place like that is with the advantage of surprise. And with all the visibility now, it's very problematical. And a lot of the discussions that, well, we're going to do it next year and so forth are regarded as cover stories to hit them now as a surprise. So who knows what's going to go on? This changes daily. The Iraqi military strength, they have about over 400,000 active troops and 650,000 reserves, in other words, 1 million men. They have over 2,000 tanks. Most of them are Soviet T-84s, T-72s, and T-62s. They have a lot of aircraft, 300 Russian MiGs, 25s, 27, 29s, and some French Mirages. But less than half are operational, according to the best intelligence we have. Naval, they have about 2,000 strong. Most of the vessels are not operational. They're not really a primary naval power, obviously. Well, let's move on to Iran. This is one of the big gorillas on the block. They are, of course, have a lot of sea frontage to the south, and they're obviously east of Iraq and Turkey. They're just south of Central Asia, and they border Afghanistan and Pakistan to the east, very strategically located. And they have been all through history a major player, very colorful player, both from a current events point of view and also from a biblical point of view. It's worthwhile understanding the background. Not just the Persian Empire, which we're familiar with, but the Parthian Empire that derives from that is the rival to Rome to the east, out of which come the Magi and so forth. This really has a start when a guy by the name of Cyrus, who's half Mede, or Kurd if you will, and half Persian, unites the empire and accomplishes a great deal. Now, during his rise, Daniel is appointed head of the Magi. The Persian Empire had a group of people that were a hereditary Median, and they were Medes. They were hereditary priesthood that had the power to appoint the king. So they weren't just religious leaders, they also had administrative power. That's where we get the term magistrate, from the Magi of Persia. What's strange is Cyrus appoints Daniel, a Jew, in charge of them. You can imagine how that went over to that. That's what led to the lion's den thing in Daniel chapter 6, by the way. But the reason I footnoted here is Daniel also apparently had some prophecies that were guarded as a cabal or a secret group that leads to the Magi visiting the Christ child, Matthew 2. And most people don't realize that because they don't know the background. The Magi came in force. I'll come back to that a little bit later. In 490 is the Battle of Marathon. It's one of the first defeats by the Greeks against the Persians. Xerxes shows up at 45. He's probably the king in the book of Esther. And but in 331 BC, we have the Battle of Gaugamela, which is the one where the Greeks finally defeat their traditional, bitterly hated adversary by this young guy, Alexander the Great. And what doesn't come up unless you really look for it is the Parthian Empire, which was from the 2nd century BC through the 2nd century AD, sort of a rival to Rome, at least in the region. And they were very successful at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC. The Romans were disastrously defeated there. In 40 BC, the Romans retreat from Judea. Most people don't realize this. In 37 BC, Mark Antony reestablishes sovereignty, but a subsequent invasion is rebuffed. Herod is appointed king of Judea, but he's in Rome for 3 years because it's not safe for him to be in Judea. He only can return after a 5-month siege. You need to understand that to realize how tenuous even though he's an appointee of Rome and Judea, it was a buffer zone. And so when the Magi shows up, obviously with military escort, the kingmakers of Persia, he could reasonably presume they're trying to precipitate some kind of border incident. When they say, where is he that's born king of the Jews, that's a put down, because he's not Jewish. He's an Edomite appointed by Rome. But he's polite to them and nervous, and they, of course, come because they're discharging a mission given them by Daniel. They worship the Christ child, but they're warned supernaturally to go another way, and you know the story. About 2 BC or 4 BC, depending on your authorities, Christ is born, the Magi discharge the prophetic mission. Getting back to Iran, about the 600s, obviously the Arabs are on the rise. They conquered Iran very early. And Iran then became a leading center for Islam. It is one of the 2 countries that are Shiites. These are Iran is Shiites and Yemen are Shiites. The rest of the Islamic world pretty much is Sunnis. And they have their own differences and so forth. By the time you get to the end of the millennium, the Seljuk Turks conquered much of Iran. And as the 13th century comes, the Mongol armies, led by Genghis Khan, overrun Iran, leaving their cultural imprint. But then as they get to the 15th through the 18th centuries, different dynasties start coming. The Afghan armies even capture Isfahan in the 18th century. And finally, the Nadir Shah drove the Afghans from Iran and plundered the Indian city of Delhi. At the end of the 18th century, the Qajar dynasty is established. And finally, they get a constitutional government in 1906. And it tried to remain neutral during the First World War, but it was a battleground because obviously all the players are trying to get at their oil deposits. And finally, a cavalry officer establishes the he became Shah in 1925. And he introduced many reforms, but he also was very repressive. In 1941, both the British and Soviet troops invade as part of World War II activities. And that's when Mohammad Reza Pahlavi became the Shah. In 51, they nationalized their oil industry. In the 60s, the Shah introduced a lot of economic reforms, so-called White Revolution. He assumed nearly complete control, but while he accomplished a lot of reforms, he also ruthlessly suppressed all government opposition. In 79, frankly, through some of the meddling of the United States, the Shah left the country, and Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile to found the Islamic Republic of Iran. And that's when it emerged as a major problem for us. And the U.S. Embassy was seized, you may recall, 59 hostages held and so on. And then that brings us to the 1980-88 war between Iran and Iraq. And a ceasefire, of course, was finally negotiated in 88. And now, in 89, Ayatollah Khomeini died of an illness, and Rafsanjani was elected president by a very popular vote. And he sought to improve the relationship with Western nations on the one hand. At the same time, he also had a dream of what he called the Islamic Crescent, to somehow unite all the Muslims from the 200 million Indonesia, which is the largest Islamic country, all the way, a crescent, all the way to Morocco. That was their dream. Of course, in 1995, we instituted a trade embargo against Iran to try to curb what was increasingly conspicuous as their support for international terrorism. And in 97, of course, a more moderate cleric, Khatami, was elected president, again by a wide margin. Well, what's Iran's military strength? They have over 500,000 active troops and 350,000 reserves. They have over 1,300 tanks, consisting mostly of Soviet T-62s and T-54s. They have some U.S. tanks also. In aircraft, they have almost 900, most of which are F-5s and F-4s, and a small number of F-14s. But what's misleading here is they also took control of a large number of Soviet MiG-29s and Su-27s that fled Iraq just before the Persian Gulf War. The pilots took their equipment and flew for safety to Iran, and Iran inherited some uncounted numbers of modern aircraft. They have about 20,000 troops servicing several large frigates and German-built subs, but they've also, we understand, acquired Silkworm missiles from China in 1999. Iran has the largest standing army in the Middle East, excluding Turkey, which is a NATO member. It has the largest budget for defense, but of course they've been hindered by 20 years of embargoes. And it has an arsenal of ballistic missiles based on Chinese technology, as does several of the players there. And we know they're aggressively pursuing atomic, biological, and chemical weapons. Well, the next player is Saudi Arabia. This is their very distinctive flag. They first adopted this famous green banner in the 18th century when they began conquering parts of the Arabian Peninsula. In 1901, they added the inscription. In Arabic, it says, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is Allah's prophet." The sword was added in 1906 to symbolize their military triumphs of Islam. And in the 1906, the sword emblem was modified from time to time, most recently in 73. But, of course, Saudi Arabia, I think most of us recognize where it is. It's a very strategic location. In their history, of course, you really want to start probably marking it from the 6th century, when Muhammad was born in Mecca. The 7th century, he returned from Medina and conquered Mecca, which is interesting. That required him to violate the sacred covenant he made with his own tribe. As soon as he's strong enough, he just wiped them out. What's interesting about that betrayal is they celebrate it. It's part of the Islamic culture that you do whatever it takes to win. And anyway, the Islamic conquest of Arabia began by 1660. The caliphs moved the headquarters from Medina to Damascus, Syria. And Arabia, from that point on, declines in importance within the Muslim empire, strangely enough, even though it's the site of Mecca and Medina. By the time you get to the 15th century, the Saud dynasty was founded near Riyadh, and by the time you get into the 18th century, they helped spread a particular sect of Islam called Wahhabism, which is the most strict and legalistic sect within Islam. About 80% of the Muslim leadership in the United States is of the Wahhabi sect, because Saudi Arabia funds it. And you need to understand, despite all the disinformation that's promoted by the press and elsewhere, that it's a peaceful religion, the truth of the matter is it's not. And secondly, the leadership that's dominant is the most militant bunch, despite lip service to the contrary. Well, anyway, we get to the 19th century, 1824. Following the defeat by the Ottoman forces, the Saud family establishes a new capital at Riyadh, and as the century closes, 1891, family feuds start weakening the Saudi power, and much of Arabia was conquered then, of course, by the Ottomans and other local tribal chiefs. And the Saudi family then fled to Kuwait. And by 1902, Saud returns from Kuwait and captures Riyadh again. And it goes back and forth through the early parts of the 20th century. But by 1932, Ibn Saud has proclaimed the unified kingdom of Saudi Arabia. 1938, the first major petroleum deposit was discovered. It becomes, in 1945, a founding member of the United Nations and also of the Arab League. And 1953, when Ibn Saud dies, he's succeeded by his eldest son. In 1964, Saud was forced from the throne and succeeded by his brother Faisal. And he used the oil profits to modernize the country and made Saudi Arabia very active in world affairs. And they have offered financial support to Arab countries fighting Israel during the Six-Day War. And they've been behind the scenes more than is generally obvious from the press. In the 1970s, of course, rising oil prices greatly increased their export earnings. So a lot of ambitious development projects were funded by the New Wealth. Well, in 1973, following the Yom Kippur War, they, of course, reduced the oil exports to many Western countries, partly to raise the prices. And by 1982, Crown Prince Fahd assumed the throne after the death of his half-brother, King Khalid. And then in 1990, after Iraq invaded Kuwait, troops from the United States and other Western nations arrived in Saudi Arabia to help defend the country against the Iraqi invasion. We all know about that, Desert Storm. What most people don't realize, they also had another mission, and that's to prop up the throne, because the House of Saud was always in jeopardy. That's why after the Persian Gulf War, we didn't pull all our troops out. There were large numbers there, and that's what Osama bin Laden complained about, because the cover stories that were issued to explain it just didn't make sense. And that was one of the irritations among the fundamentalists. In that case, 1991, we have the Persian Gulf War. And of course, Saudi Arabia joins a US-led coalition that drove Iraq out of Kuwait, which is saying it sort of backwards. We're there really to benefit them as much as anybody. There's calls for governmental reform in 1993. In 1995, Saudi Arabia is a signatory of the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. I think that's interesting to notice, because we now discover that they've been funding Pakistan's nuclear program with over $1 billion. Pakistan has nuclear weapons, and they are a source of supply of those weapons to Saudi Arabia today. In 1999, Saudi Arabia, along with other oil-producing nations, again agreed to reduce production to raise oil prices. Last year, we discovered something rather interesting. At the El Solayel missile base, it's a major construction project with housing for the Chinese engineers that are installing Chinese ballistic missiles. And we now know they also have nuclear weapons, warheads, supplied by Pakistan. Now, if you look at the troops, they have about 100,000 active, 57,000. They're not large in numbers. They don't have to be. We're there to always back them up. They have 1,000 tanks, mostly U.S. tanks, some British Centurions. Small now, 76 F-15, some British Tornadoes. 13,000 naval troops, a small fleet of patrol and missile ships. Strategic weapons is the key there. They have one of the most advanced missile programs in the region, purchased from the Chinese, and, as I say, nuclear warheads. If you look at the map of Saudi Arabia, southwest of Riyadh, there's El Solayel missile base. There are presently at least 120 CSS-2 Chinese missiles there on 12 launchers. There are about 30 or 40 buildings, by the way, holding the housing and the construction troops and all this. Anyway, these missiles have apparently capable of 3 warheads each. And they have a range of 3,500 kilometers, which means they can reach with their missiles to Libya, to Greece, certainly most of Turkey, and certainly most of Iran. They can reach all the way to parts of India, certainly covering Pakistan, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, what have you. So they're the big gorilla on the block. It's interesting because they're always positioned in the news as almost an ally of the United States, but in fact, they are very, very much the puppet master behind much of what goes on in the Middle East. Well, let's take a look at Egypt. The flag of Egypt, by the way, is based on the traditional Arab colors, which is interesting because the Egyptians are Hamites, not Shemites, but that's a whole other thing. The emblem in the middle, if you're wondering what that is the hawk of Saladin, which appears in their arms. It was added in the flag in 1984. But Egypt, I guess most of us know where it is. It's obviously in the northeast corner of Africa. It's the site of the second earliest empires, very prominent in 3000 BC when they were unified, Upper and Lower Egypt and so forth. The Old Kingdom, they estimate that in the 2600 BC is when, call it almost 5,000 years ago, when the pyramids were constructed. But remember that the Great Pyramid was probably built long before those. They were copies of something that happened earlier. But in any case, you get to about 1400 BC and you get to the place where the Egyptian Empire is at its peak, and it also brings you about the time of the Exodus in Egypt, by the way, controlled most of the Middle East from Syria to Ethiopia in those days. 332 BC, Alexander the Great conquers Egypt and founded the city of Alexandria, which serves as its capital until finally later it's changed to Cairo. 31 BC, of course, a Roman fleet decisively defeated Egyptian forces when Antony and Cleopatra, at the Battle of Actium, and became a Roman province the next year. And we get to the 7th century, of course, we have the Arab invasions. They conquered Egypt in 642 and introduced Islam and Arabic language into the country. And it's in the 10th century that the Fatimid rulers moved the capital from Alexandria, which had been a major cultural center, to the new city of Cairo. And it quickly became the center of the Islamic world in that day. Saladin finally overthrows the Fatimids and establishes his dynasty, and the Sunni Islam was restored as the state religion. Notice they're Sunnis, not Shiites. The Mamluk bodyguards overthrew the Sultan and seized control of Egypt in the 13th century. In the 16th century, the Ottomans take over, but they really rule the place through the Mamluks. They retained local authority, and they'll eventually challenge the Ottoman power in Egypt. But you get to the end of the 18th century, and Napoleon Bonaparte led a French invasion of Egypt. And this is interesting for no other reason than that's when they began to discover some incredible archaeological treasures, like the Rosetta Stone and so on. In 1805, not many years later, Muhammad Ali secures control of Egypt and then steers the country on an ambitious modernization program. When you get to the end of the 19th century, the British troops have occupied Egypt, but a nationalist movement springs up. And it isn't too many years to 1914, First World War era, that Great Britain declares Egypt a protectorate, but they become independent right after the war. In 1922, they become independent. But Great Britain is still really pulling the strings. In 1942, the German advance in North Africa is very famous during World War II. It was halted by the Allied forces at the Battle of El Alamein. And what most people don't realize, that battle was a turning point of the war in North Africa, was because of cryptography. Churchill said, we never had before El Alamein, we never had a victory. After El Alamein, we never had a defeat. But what he's really commenting on, hidden between lines, is that we had broken the codes. And in 1948, Egypt and other Arab countries invaded the newly created state of Israel, but of course were soundly defeated. In 1952, Gamal Abdel Nasser led a revolt that overthrew Egypt's monarchy. And 2 years later, Nasser assumed complete executive authority. It's interesting to notice that despite the facades, every Islamic country is a dictatorship. Democracy and Islam do not coexist. That's often hidden by the labels they give some of the groups, but it's always a dictatorship. Anyway, 1956 was when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal to finance the Aswan Dam. And of course, French, British, and Israeli armies invaded and captured the Sinai Peninsula, and the UN negotiated a settlement. In 1958 is when Egypt and Syria forms what's called the United Arab Republic. Now, Syria withdrew within 3 years, but Egypt continued to use the name for over 10 years more, until 1971. And of course, 1967 is the Six-Day War. Egypt lost the Sinai Peninsula and most of its air force. In 1970, Nasser dies, and he's succeeded by Anwar al-Sadat. And 73 is the Yom Kippur War, and that's where Egypt fought Israel and really got clobbered. Eric Sharon actually had the whole Third Army circled, and the U.S. dispatched Kissinger to bring it all to a halt and negotiate away the advantages they had from that engagement, largely. But in 79, Egypt and Israel signed a peace treaty and arranged for the return of the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt. And within 2 years, Sadat was assassinated by military officers because of that, by the way, and he was succeeded by Hosni Mubarak. In 91, the Egyptian forces participated in the Persian Gulf War against Iraq. You know, it's interesting that you do really have some of these players playing against each other with the West on a couple of occasions. This idea of a coalition, in large measure, often sounds like a facade, a political facade. In many respects it is. On the other hand, it is interesting that you can rally these people against one another. Anyway, Egypt has one of the largest and best equipped armies in the region. They have almost 500,000 active troops and 250,000 reserve. They have almost 4,000 U.S.-made M1A1 tanks and M60s. They have almost 2,000 aircraft. Half of them are F-16s, and they have about 300 attack choppers. And they have about 12,000 naval troops, 4 subs, and 1 destroyer. But our intelligence sources indicate that Egypt is developing atomic, biological, and chemical weapons to counterbalance the Israeli arsenal, which, of course, is substantial. Well, let's take a look at Syria. And I couldn't resist putting a picture again of the river Euphrates. It comes up so often, not only in the book of Genesis, but the book of Revelation. So you want to be sensitive to that, learn what you can about it. It's going to stay in the news. And Syria, of course, is in a very, very interesting strategic position. It is just northwest of Israel. In fact, you can say north because they've taken over Lebanon. And major player. Not a big player, but very key. All the traditional empires that we've been through, from Sumer, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, when you get to Greece, something very important happens. When Alexander dies, his 4 generals divide up the empire. There are 4 of them, but the 2 major players are Seleucus and Ptolemy. Seleucus takes Syria, Persia, Babylonia, and India, and he rules it from Antioch. That leads to what they call the Seleucid Empire. That, you realize, is northwest of Israel. Ptolemy, his other general, takes Egypt, claims Palestine, and Arabia Petra. And he rules from Alexandria, which at the time is the capital of Egypt. These 2 guys are constantly fighting for the next 4 centuries. Israel is a buffer zone between the 2 of them. Now, we often talk about the silent years between the Old and New Testament, because the book of Malachi closes the books of the Old Testament, and there's about 400 years before you get to the New Testament. Most of that 400 years is laid out in the Bible, historically, in advance in Daniel chapter 11. And it's very, very important because there are many scholars that believe that the Antichrist will rise from the Seleucid Empire area. That may shock many people. I said, gee, I thought he was going to be a Roman. He's from the Roman Empire. That was part of the Roman Empire. And if you read Daniel 11, you'll get some surprises. Lysimachus takes what we call Turkey and Cassander, Greece, and Macedonia, but they're minor players from our point of view. And, of course, all this becomes a Roman province by 64 BC and through about 635. Now, the empire is divided. I say, here's a map. Seleucus takes the area of Syria and eastward, Ptolemy in the south. And Seleucus and Ptolemy, of course, are in conflict. In Daniel 11, Seleucus and his successors are called the king of the north, and Ptolemy is the king of the south. The word king and kingdom are identical in the Hebrew, so you can call it king or kingdom, melech, either way. But this is detailed in Daniel 11 from verses 1 through 20 and worth your study. Anyway, we'll go on. Syria. Muslim conquest, 7th century by the Muslims, of course. They're also trampled by the Crusaders in 1099. Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt, takes over in the 12th century The 13th century, you've got the Mongol invasion. In the 15th, 16th century, you got the Ottoman Empire. And that leads you to the 19th century. Big event there is 1869, the Suez Canal, which totally changes the trade routes. That dries up the economies of many of the Middle Eastern countries which made their living by being host to the caravan routes that went across. Well, the Suez Canal, water transportation eclipses that, changes the profile. In 1919, it surfaces that the 1916 secret agreement, Sykes-Picot Agreement, surfaces, and among other things, that Syria and Lebanon, they discover, has been assigned to France as part of that secret agreement. So we have the French mandate in Syria, and it, of course, upsets a lot of the Arabs. I'll come back to that later. The French mandate is in the early part of the 20th century, all kinds of uprising in 1920, 25, 27. They finally yield partial independence in 1938, and the so-called Republic starts then. About 1945, they actually become a member of the UN. In 48, though, they, of course, fight against Israel. In 49, 51, and 54, there are military coups that take power. It's very volatile. But there's a continual anti-West, certainly anti-Israel, and pro-Soviet posturing. And, of course, in 58, they form the United Arab Republic with Egypt, but that's really a name only. It gets dissolved in a couple of years. Through the early to middle 60s, there's all kinds of coups and attempts. I'll spare you. 67, of course, you have the Six-Day War with Israel, and which, of course, is a disaster for them. And in 1970, General Hafez al-Assad seizes power. In 73, of course, is the Yom Kippur War with Israel. And Israel obviously not only drove them miraculously off the Golan Heights against superior odds and all that, they actually advanced within 20 miles of Damascus. And humiliating defeat, which, of course, still is a bone in their throat to this day. 76, Syria occupies Lebanon. You know, it's interesting, all the flack that Israel is getting for its so-called occupied territories, Syria just occupies Lebanon, and no one says boo. They're doing that today. What do they want? Lebanon. You know, Lebanon used to be the Paris of the Middle East. Beautiful, beautiful place to visit. And now it's a war zone. It's astonishing transformation. What does Syria want it for? Drugs. The Bekaa Valley is one of the primary sources of opium and heroin, whatever, in the world. And that funds, that gives Syria, this little relatively small country, the ability to fund global terrorism. So there's Syria, and there is Lebanon. They just walked over it, they own it, they run it, and no one says much about it. And of course, that's a real problem for the northern border of Israel. There's constant problems and so forth. Well, in 1980, they signed a 20-year cooperation with the Soviet Union. Of course, within 10 years, the Soviet Union is starting to fall apart. But in 1990, they joined the anti-Iraq coalition during the Persian Gulf War. It's interesting, here again, they are willing to join, at least to some extent, in a war against Iraq. So these groups, even though they have Islam in common, they have all kinds of reasons to be mad at each other, quite apart from Israel. In fact, you can almost say that Israel is the only thing that unites them, is their hatred for Israel. So, long and troubled history with Iraq. In 1998, there are tensions over Syria's support of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK. That's a guerrilla force that's fighting for a Kurdish homeland in southeastern Turkey. See, again, where these countries come together, part of the dynamics are the various Kurdish groups that are backed by various groups. In the year 2000, of course, Assad dies from complications of heart disease. Let's take a look at the military strength. About 300,000 active and about 400,000 reserves, about almost 5,000 Soviet tanks, T-62s and 72s, 2,500 aircraft, MiG-21s, 23s, 35s, and they have Su-23s through to 35s, and we have 72 attack choppers. They have also put on order $2 billion worth of new fighter planes from Russia. Now, in strategic weapons, they do maintain large ballistic missile arsenal that's provided by North Korea with biological and chemical warheads. We don't know that they have nuclear yet, but there's no reason. It's all a question of dollars. There's an active black market in that world. Let's talk about Jordan. This one is a very different creature altogether. The Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. It is not an ancient kingdom, but rather a European creation of 1946. It was a desert wasteland that was full of nomadic Bedouin tribes for centuries. It, of course, is due east of Israel, and it borders, obviously, on the Jordan River. You know, the Jordan River is the only river in the world with one bank, you know. You know that. That's supposed to be, see, it has only the West Bank, right? Okay. Prior to World War I, the areas of Ammon, Moab, and Edom, those are the biblical names, had previously been populated by unaffiliated Bedouin tribes. And during the war, the British and the Allies were fighting Germans and Ottoman Turks. So Major T.E. Lawrence organized his widely publicized Arab revolt. There are many critics that feel this was in large measure a fiction of the British Foreign Office. They used it for propaganda purposes. He did various things and they exaggerated their impact. But in any case, General Allenby was ultimately victorious in the Middle East. And so the League of Nations awarded the British a mandate on April 25th of 1920 that would endure until May 14th of 1948, when they would abandon it. And in 1921, a very aggressive young man named Abdallah, he was a son of Sharif Hussein of Mecca in Arabia, moved into the land east of the Jordan River with his troops. The British colonial secretary recognized Abdallah as the Emir of Transjordan. That's something he created with a stroke of his pen. There was no that's what created Transjordan, and he dubs him he's the Emir of this. It's a way of he did it for his own political reasons. And Abdallah then consolidated control with his British-trained so-called Arab Legion. I should mention that this British colonial secretary at the time, his name was Winston Churchill, early in his career. In 46, after the war, Abdallah was crowned king of Transjordan. And since 1999, by the way, his great-grandson, Abdullah II, is the current king. The previous king, of course, was very popular, very interesting guy, but I won't go into that. Let's see. In 48, Jordan joined the attack against Israel in its War of Independence and successfully fought the Haganah and held what we call today the West Bank. And in 67, again joining Egypt in the Six-Day War, they lost it. Now, on the one hand, you can be critical of Jordan in a sense for allying themselves against Israel because they have good relationships otherwise, but you've got to realize Jordan's almost a pawn of the Muslim and the Arab politics in the region. Okay, in 1998, having previously repudiated any rights to the West Bank, Jordan signed the peace treaty with Israel at Camp David. So, see, there really haven't been serious problem in Israel and Jordan, and they repudiated any rights to the region that's still being contested by everybody else, and they signed the peace treaty. This is a legitimate, real. This wasn't one of these pressured things by Washington. Well, they have about 100,000 troops, 35,000 reserves. It's a small country. They have 1,000 tanks, a couple hundred aircraft, F-16s, 480 naval troops, small border patrol outfit. No strategic weapons to our awareness. But there is something else that's strategic we should mention before we leave Jordan. There is an interesting verse in Daniel chapter 11, verse 41. It's in that from about verse 36 on in Daniel 11. He's talking about the guy we call the Antichrist, this world leader. And speaking of him, in verse 41, it says, "He shall enter also into the glorious land," which of course is an idiom for Israel. "And many countries shall be overthrown." No surprise. "But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon." Well, this is very, very provocative because for some reason, that region escapes the thumb of the Antichrist. As Bible students, we can't resist the conjecture that this may be to give the remnant a place to flee, because they flee to Petra from other passages and so forth. That's one possibility. There's another possibility that we should keep an open mind on, and that is that these tribes did not keep themselves separate the way Israel did. They commingled. The word Ishmaelite, for example, is not restricted to a son of Ishmael. It's used many times in the Old Testament as just an idiomatic term for the people in a general region. And that may also be true of Edom, Moab, and Ammon. It's even conceivable that this may be an allusion to the Muslims. And that is, if that's possible, that really changes possible perspectives. I'll leave that with you to explore and do some homework on. Let's look at Turkey, member of NATO. With the decline of the Byzantine Empire in the 14th century, the Turkish tribes in Anatolia, that's the old part of Turkey. If you take the part of the Turkey that's the bulk of it, that is east of the Bosphorus, that's Anatolia, pretty much. The Turkish tribes there established the Ottoman Empire, as I mentioned, and that lasted until after World War I, when the modern state of Turkey emerges from it. So it's really, in a sense, the vestiges of the Ottoman Empire. And it's very strategically located. It has today, of course, both sides of the Bosphorus, which is a critical channel to the Black Sea and so forth. You've got to the east, you've got Greece, Bulgaria, Romania. And to the north, you've got you've got mostly Russia and Georgia, Ukraine, what have you. You've got Central Asia, Armenia and Azerbaijan to the going east, and of course Syria to the south, and Iran, of course, to the direct east. Iran and Iraq and Syria border to the south. But one of the strategic things about Turkey is the border between Turkey and Syria. Turkey is the gorilla on the block, and one thing that can keep Syria in check is the Turkish generals. We'll talk about that as we go. But the story of Turkey in modern times has to be focused on, since World War I, this guy by the name of Kemal Atatürk. He aggressively transformed Turkey from a Muslim-dominated theocratic autocracy into a Western-oriented democracy. An incredible achievement when you really understand what's involved. In 1922, he abolished the Sultanate. In 1924, he abolished the Caliphate and the religious courts. He's totally restructuring the country. In 25, he made it illegal to wear the fez, the traditional red hat that I'm sure you've seen, which is he regarded as a symbol of backwardness. And having rid Turkey of the trappings of Islamic backwardness, he then proceeded to adopt all kinds of Western ways. In 25, he adopted the Western calendar. Think about that. He changed their calendar. That's not easy. In 26, he adopted the Swiss Civil Code and later the Italian Penal Code. In 28, the country switched to the Latin alphabet. He changed the alphabet of the country. In 31, the metric system. I'm always reminded by my British friends. They say if God wanted us on the metric system, he would have had 10 disciples, but I let that go. In 1934, all Turks were obliged to take a surname, and Mustafa Kemal became Kemal Atatürk, and the women were given the vote. This is a radical guy. He achieved all this. Why? He spent 70 years trying to get Turkey to be a member of the West. That was his dream. And following World War II, they joined all the main Western institutions, the UN in 45, the International Monetary Fund in 47, the OECD in 48, the Council of Europe in 49, NATO in 1951. Now in 1963, 4 years after application, Turkey received an associate membership in the European Community, and it specifically provided that they would be a full member later. Well, the crisis began to loom as Turkey applied for full membership in the European Community on April 14th of 1987. Now, as I say, its associate membership agreement of 63 specifically held out full membership as an eventual goal. Now, their application in 1987 was ahead of Austria, Finland, Sweden, and Norway, whose applications subsequently were accepted and expedited. And so it now has become very clear to them that they've bing rejected by the succeeding organization, the European Union. So they've been left out in the cold. They've been left out in the hallway, as the journalists in Europe put it. They recognize that they are just not accepted as a member of the West by the West. And they're they're in the embarrassing, because they've had the slap in the face, they have no choice but to turn back to Eurasia. And by the way, I should point out that 4 out of 5 of the Soviet Central Asian republics are Turkic speaking. Tajikistan is an exception, speaking a Persian dialect. And now the President, Süleyman Demirel, he's headed an active drive to extend Turkish influence into the region of Central Asia, in other words, to the east. An interesting quote, he says, "The emergence of the Turkic world is one of the most significant developments of this century. A new continent called Eurasia has been born in the geographic space that stretches from the Adriatic Sea to the Great Wall of China. Eurasia is tantamount to the Turkic world." It's interesting, by the way, notice that his concept of Eurasia includes Muslim Bosnia and Muslim Albania. Now, one thing we need to do as we try to get a worldview here is to recognize there are dynamics in the East. I mean, I'm not just talking, we always think West, from the Roman Empire, the Western arm of that. Much of the prophetic scriptures focus on major global centroids that will emerge in the remnants of the old Roman Empire that are east of Turkey. In other words, Byzantium and eastward. So we keep an eye on that. And when you're reading your prophetic scriptures, don't equate the Roman Empire with Italy. Okay. Now, there are three major factors bringing about a strategic change in the Middle East with regards to Turkey. The rejection of the European Union, of course, of their membership, the opening up of the Turkic world in Central Asia, and the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in Turkey. The generals are still in control, and they have 16 military assistance pacts with Israel. They trade air bases and so forth. But the tide is against them because each election the Muslims are growing. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to recognize there's a tide of Turkey shifting to the east. And this is very important because they are major players against Israel in the invasion that Ezekiel talks about in chapter 38 and 39. Meshech and Tubal were traditional cities in Anatolia, and so that they're idiomatic, if you will, of Turkey. So even though it's pro-West at the moment, you can anticipate it refocusing. Okay. I'm going to add a little addenda. This isn't really Middle East, but I think it's in the spirit of our briefing, of three other topics. India, very briefly. Pakistan, most people do not understand where it came from. And something that may shock you called the Shanghai Pact. Let's talk briefly about India. Obviously, it's in a very strategic location, very large country, very populous country. We don't have to build statistics on that part of it. And of course, they were victims of the Turkic Muslim invaders, the Mongol Empire and Genghis Khan, and other empires we won't detail here. In the 15th century, the Europeans, the Portuguese especially, the Dutch, the French, the British, of course, also ultimately dominate in their various enterprises. In the 18th and 19th century, the British Empire is the dominant one in India from 1756 till its independence in 47. Very exploitive administration of their 565 principalities. During this time also there's an industrial revolution going on, and the economies of India and England became very interlinked, but always to the advantage, of course, of England. And of course, the opening up of the Suez Canal again brings India logistically much closer to Great Britain, from 3 months now to 3 weeks to ship. But in 1914, to give you just one data point, less than 5% of the national income, less than 1% of India's workforce was employed in factories. In other words, they're not getting the benefit of the Industrial Revolution. That leads to a rebellion of the mercenaries, the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857, that also led to a rise of Indian nationalism. Bear in mind, there are 565 principalities, but they're beginning to think of themselves as a collective group. But so do the Muslims. They're a minority, but widespread. So not only is there an Indian National Congress in 1885, but within roughly about 11 years, we have the Muslim League. So Mahatma Gandhi shows up about this time, and we finally, of course, through his non-violence, non-compliance tactics, does achieve independence in 1947. And of course, after that, there's all kinds of other problems. I won't get into all that. They have all kinds of turmoil. But the main things I want to highlight of the recent history is that there continues to be intense Hindu-Muslim rivalries, on the one hand. And secondly, there are nuclear developments. They tested 5 warheads in May of 1998. They tested their ICBMs in April of 1999. Both India and Pakistan, they're running neck and neck. But they are, right now today, a nuclear power. So let's take a look at Pakistan, because that has a very special story. Pakistan, and you have West Pakistan, which is the Pakistan of today, and you have another country originally called East Pakistan. There's 1,000 miles between them, but they were both born of the same midwife, so to speak. British had ruled India for 200 years, from 1756 to 1947. As I mentioned, there was the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, obviously always with different views, so tense that Britain finally decided there were irreconcilable differences. And the only way to resolve this is to partition the country. So before they gave India its independence, they gave Pakistan their independence. and West Pakistan, which is Pakistan today, and they also created East Pakistan, which is now called Bangladesh. And the problems in Bangladesh aren't so much Muslim as they are Buddhist, but the point is they're both representing primarily dominant minority groups. India became independent the next day, August 15th, 1947. And of course, immediately there's a huge migration. 3.5 million Hindus and Sikhs moved from the Pakistan region to India. 5 million Muslims moved from India to Pakistan. 562 princes choose one or the other. It's simple there, except there are 3 guys that choose neither. And one of them is a Hindu ruler who has primarily a Muslim population. And so India explains that more clearly to him with their arms in that September. And the other prince was a Muslim ruler who had a dominant Hindu population. And India simply annexed his territory. So 2 of the 3 were quickly resolved by force. But there is a third that was run by a Hindu ruler but had an 85% Muslim population. He decided to join India. Now, Pakistan, of course, questioned his right to do that, and war broke out. India presently occupies 2/3 of that region, but the deadlock still persists and may very well trigger a war between them, and that war could easily escalate to nuclear arms. So that's what's going on right now. Kashmir remains unresolved, and war preparations are imminent. Tensions continue, and both are continuing to arm. Realize that nuclear weapons tests in 1998 on both sides, ICBM testing in 1999 on both sides. There are all kinds of elections, and it gets very bitter, but we'll just watch and see. One other thing I want to talk about, in 1999 was the 50th anniversary of NATO. But it redefined itself on that day, not as a defensive alliance, which is what it was formed for. 15 countries back in 1949 agreed to defend each other if any one of them was attacked. It was a defensive alliance. Obviously, primarily put together because of the threat of the Soviet Union. But its 50th anniversary, it redefined itself as a world police force. That's what justified the invasion of Kosovo was justified on that basis. Well, when they did that, that terrified not just our adversaries, but our allies as well. But within 2 years, it led to the Shanghai Pact. Russia, China, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan formed a pact with a specific objective of containing or resisting the hegemony of the United States. And what's shocking about this isn't just a piece of paper. The Chinese and the Russians have already begun practicing military operations against the U.S. They're just training exercises, but they clearly, the context of them is a war with the U.S. To put this in perspective, you see on the map, you see that little tiny blip in the middle on the left is Israel. There's Russia, there's China, and there's Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. That's the really big gorilla on the block. And that is another reason we watch with great interest the Magog passages in Ezekiel 38 and 39. Well, that ends this first session. The next session will be what I'll call the real war, a biblical perspective of this and the plight of Israel, which even today Israel does not understand. And we'll take that up in the next session.